A hero doesn't always wear a suit. Sometimes, a hero wears a faded housekeeping uniform soaked by the rain. The black SUV burst through the steel guardrail with a deafening screech, skidding across the slick bridge before disappearing nose first into the swollen river below. For one suspended heartbeat, every sound seemed to vanish. The evening traffic froze beneath a blanket of cold October rain outside Charlotte, North Carolina. Drivers stepped out of their vehicles, phones already raised, their wide eyes fixed on the dark water where only ripples remained. Someone shouted for 911. Another whispered that nobody could survive a crash like that. But one person wasn't watching. Maya Brooks was already running. Her housekeeping shoes splashed through icy puddles as she dropped the grocery bag she had been carrying after finishing a 12-hour shift cleaning luxury apartments across the city. Apples rolled across the wet pavement. A loaf of bread landed beside the curb. She never looked back. The river swallowed the vehicle inch by inch, its headlights glowing beneath the surface like fading stars. Maya reached the broken railing, breathing hard as freezing wind whipped rain across her face. For the briefest moment, fear caught her chest. She couldn't see who was inside. She didn't know whether the driver was young or old, kind or cruel, rich or poor. None of it mattered. Her late mother had once told her, if someone needs help, don't stop to ask who they are. Ask whether you still have time. Those words echoed louder than the storm. Maya kicked off her shoes and dove into the dark water. The cold stole her breath instantly, wrapping around her like sheets of ice. She fought the current, every stroke pulling her closer to the sinking SUV. Inside, through fractured glass blurred by swirling water, she spotted a man slumped over the steering wheel. His expensive watch caught a flicker of light before disappearing beneath the murky current. She grabbed the driver's door. It refused to move. She pulled again. Nothing. Air bubbles escaped from the cabin as the river continued claiming the vehicle. Above the bridge, strangers watched in stunned silence, powerless. Except for their prayers. Maya searched desperately until her fingers found the shattered side window. Ignoring the freezing water pressing against her body, she reached inside, unclipped the man's seatbelt, and wrapped both arms beneath his shoulders. He was heavier than she expected. For one terrifying second, neither of them moved. Then the current shifted. The vehicle tilted just enough for Maya to pull him free. Every muscle in her body screamed as she kicked toward the surface, dragging the unconscious stranger through the relentless river. When they finally broke into the open air, gasps erupted from the bridge overhead. Emergency sirens echoed in the distance, growing louder with every passing second. Maya held the man's head above the water until rescue crews reached them with a flotation raft. Exhausted beyond words, she quietly slipped away while paramedics surrounded the stranger. Nobody asked her name. Nobody noticed the soaked Maid walking barefoot back across the bridge, shivering beneath the rain. Behind her, flashing lights reflected against the river as one paramedic stared at the unconscious man's wallet and suddenly froze. "You have to notify the board immediately," he whispered. "This is Richard Harrison." Richard Harrison remained unconscious for nearly 30 hours. The news spread across every major network before sunrise. Financial analysts speculated about the future of Harrison Capital. Reporters gathered outside Charlotte Memorial Hospital beneath rows of satellite trucks and bright television lights. Investors worried about the market's opening without one of the country's most influential businessmen. Inside the intensive care unit, however, none of those headlines mattered. Machines measured quiet heartbeats. Nurses adjusted blankets. Rain tapped gently against the hospital windows, washing away the last traces of the storm that had nearly changed everything forever. Miles away, Maya Brooks woke before 5 o'clock in her small apartment on the east side of the city. Her alarm clock had stopped working months earlier, but years of routine had taught her body exactly when morning began. She rubbed her muscles that still ached. From the freezing river, wrapped a faded sweater around her shoulders, and quietly prepared oatmeal for her 72-year-old grandmother, Evelyn Brooks, who smiled without noticing the bruises of exhaustion hidden beneath Maya's calm expression. Maya never mentioned the rescue. She simply told her grandmother that the rain had delayed the bus home. After breakfast, she placed fresh medicine beside Evelyn's favorite mug, checked the thermostat twice, and left a handwritten reminder on the refrigerator that read, "Lunch is in the blue container. I love you." She caught the number 12 city bus just before sunrise, joining construction workers, nurses, janitors, and restaurant employees beginning another ordinary day. No one recognized the quiet woman sitting near the back window with damp sneakers hanging from her backpack to dry. Her housekeeping uniform had been washed by hand overnight and still carried the faint scent of laundry soap instead of river water. Maya arrived at one of Charlotte's most exclusive residential towers precisely at 7 o'clock. She greeted the security guard with the same warm smile she offered every morning, signed the maintenance log, collected her supply cart, and began polishing marble floors that reflected the golden morning light pouring through 40-foot windows. Residents passed without looking twice. Some nodded politely. Others hurried toward elevators while speaking into expensive phones. Maya treated each apartment with the same care whether its owner noticed her work or not. She straightened family photographs, watered neglected plants when asked, folded blankets with careful hands, and quietly fixed small details that made other people's lives more comfortable. She believed dignity lived inside ordinary actions repeated with kindness. Around noon, while replacing fresh towels inside an empty penthouse, the television mounted above the fireplace interrupted the silence. A breaking news banner filled the screen. Richard Harrison had regained consciousness. Doctors expected a full recovery. Reporters praised the unidentified woman who had rescued him from the river, calling her the mysterious guardian angel of Charlotte. Maya paused for only a moment. She looked at the television, smiled softly to herself, then returned to folding another towel with perfect corners. She never imagined the man whose life she had saved owned the very building where she worked every Tuesday. She certainly never imagined that, across town, Richard Harrison had opened his eyes with only one question on his mind. He did not ask about his company. He did not ask about the stock market. His first quiet words were, "Find the woman who walked away." Richard Harrison had built an empire by trusting numbers more than people. Every morning for nearly 3 decades had begun the same way. A calendar measured to the minute, conference calls before sunrise, financial reports before breakfast, and decisions worth millions of dollars made before most of the city had poured its first cup of coffee. Control had become more than a habit. It had become the foundation of his life. Yet as pale morning light filtered through the hospital blinds, none of those routines could quiet the single question echoing in his mind. Who had jumped into a freezing river for a complete stranger without expecting anything in return? Detective Laura Bennett stood beside his bed with a slim folder resting against her arm. Emergency responders had interviewed dozens of witnesses, but their stories all ended the same way. The woman disappeared before anyone learned her name. Some described her as young. Others guessed she was in her 30s. One truck driver remembered only her soaked housekeeping uniform. Another recalled seeing her leave barefoot across the bridge carrying nothing except a worn backpack. Richard listened without interrupting. His fingers rested lightly against the hospital blanket, while the steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the room with quiet reminders that he had been given another chance. "Offer a reward," one executive suggested. "Someone will come forward." Richard slowly shook his head. If she wanted money, she would have stayed. The room fell silent. His executive assistant, Daniel Mercer, exchanged uncertain glances with the legal team. They had seen Richard negotiate billion-dollar acquisitions without showing emotion. Now he stared through the window as though searching for someone hidden beyond the skyline. Later that afternoon, after doctors approved a short walk through the rehabilitation wing, Richard passed families gathered around vending machines, volunteers arranging fresh flowers, and nurses comforting frightened patients with calm voices. Near the end of the hallway, he noticed an elderly maintenance worker struggling to push a supply cart over the edge of a loose floor mat. Before anyone else reacted, a young woman in a familiar Navy housekeeping uniform stepped away from another cart, smiled warmly, and gently helped him straighten the wheels before continuing on her way without waiting for thanks. Richard only caught a glimpse of her profile before she disappeared around the corner, but something about the quiet confidence in her movements stirred an unfamiliar feeling. She reminded him of the witness descriptions, someone who acted first and expected nothing in return. By the time he reached the hallway intersection, she was gone. Across town, Maya Brooks finished another long shift and stopped at a neighborhood grocery store before heading home. She compared prices carefully, choosing generic brands so she could stretch every dollar. At the checkout counter, she quietly paid for an elderly veteran whose debit card had been declined. She smiled when he tried to protest and simply said, "Tomorrow might be my turn to need kindness." Then she carried her groceries into the cool evening air, completely unaware that two separate security cameras had captured the small act. Richard Harrison had spent his entire career believing greatness announced itself with headlines, wealth, and applause. He had no idea that the woman he was searching for left her greatest moments behind in silence. 3 days later, Richard Harrison insisted on returning to Harrison Capital before his physicians believed he was ready. The familiar glass headquarters rose above downtown Charlotte like a monument to certainty, its polished walls reflecting a bright autumn sky that felt strangely different after the storm. Employees lined the lobby as he entered, applauding softly while cameras flashed outside the revolving doors. Richard acknowledged them with a polite nod, but his attention wandered beyond the marble columns and polished brass fixtures. Every polished surface reminded him of the river, of cold water, of a stranger who had disappeared before hearing a single word of gratitude. As he crossed the lobby, his eyes settled on a housekeeping cart parked beside a corridor. A young woman in a navy uniform was carefully wiping fingerprints from the glass entrance doors, moving with the same quiet precision he had noticed in the hospital hallway. She kept her attention on her work even as executives hurried past in tailored suits. Richard slowed his pace almost without realizing it. Something about the calm rhythm of her movements felt familiar. Before he could speak, Daniel Mercer stepped closer and quietly said, "Her name is Maya Brooks. She works through Bright Horizon Facility Services. Tuesdays are her assigned days in this building." Richard stopped walking. The name lingered in his thoughts like an unfinished sentence. "Maya Brooks," he repeated softly. Daniel looked surprised. "Would you like me to arrange a meeting?" Richard nodded once. Less than an hour later, Maya stood outside the executive conference room, holding her housekeeping gloves in one hand. She assumed someone had complained about her work or that another security form needed her signature. The assistant opened the heavy walnut door and quietly invited her inside. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the Charlotte skyline, while sunlight stretched across the long conference table. Richard stood near the windows instead of sitting at the head of the room. He turned slowly as Maya entered, and for several seconds neither of them spoke. Richard recognized the same calm eyes described by every witness who had watched the rescue. Maya recognized the face from every television broadcast during the past week. Her expression changed only slightly. "Good afternoon, Mr. Harrison," she said politely. Richard took a careful step forward. "You knew it was me that day, did not you?" Maya gently shook her head. "No, sir. I found out later when I saw the news." "Then why did you jump?" Richard asked quietly. "Because someone needed help." The answer arrived without hesitation, without drama, without expectation. Richard opened a leather folder resting on the conference table. Inside was a certified check with more zeros than Maya had ever imagined seeing on a single piece of paper. "Please accept this," he said. "It cannot repay what you did, but it is a beginning." Maya glanced at the check for only a moment before carefully sliding it back across the table. "I appreciate your kindness, sir," she replied with a gentle smile. "But I did not save a bank account. I saved a human being. If I take money for doing what my conscience demanded, I would never feel at peace again." Silence settled across the room. Even Daniel lowered his eyes. For the first time in years, Richard Harrison found himself standing before someone whose values could not be measured, negotiated, or purchased. Outside the conference room, unnoticed by everyone inside, another executive watched through the glass wall with narrowed eyes, already wondering why a simple housekeeper had suddenly become the center of the billionaire's attention. The meeting lasted less than 10 minutes, but by the end of the afternoon, almost everyone inside Harrison Capital had heard a different version of what had happened. Some claimed the billionaire had secretly hired the housekeeper as a private advisor. Others insisted she had refused a reward because she expected something even larger. By sunset, whispers had traveled through executive offices, maintenance hallways, and employee break rooms, growing more dramatic with every retelling. Maya Brooks remained completely unaware of the rumors. She pushed her housekeeping cart from one floor to another with the same quiet focus she had shown every Tuesday for the past 3 years. She polished conference tables, replaced coffee supplies, and carefully watered the green plants lining the executive corridors. To her, nothing about the day had changed. She had simply spoken honestly to a man who wanted to thank her. But not everyone saw honesty where she saw simplicity. Senior Executive Victor Langley stood inside his corner office, watching Maya through the glass walls overlooking the hallway. For nearly 15 years, he had helped manage Harrison Capital during Richard Harrison's constant travels. He understood influence better than almost anyone inside the company, and influence rarely appeared without hidden motives. The image of a housekeeper walking into the chief executive officer's private conference room unsettled him far more than he cared to admit. Later that afternoon, Victor quietly gathered 2 department directors and spoke in a low, measured voice. "People do not refuse that kind of money without expecting something bigger," he said. "Keep an eye on her." His words spread quietly, carrying the weight of authority. Employees who had smiled warmly at Maya only hours earlier now exchanged cautious glances whenever she entered a room. Conversations stopped as she passed. Elevator doors closed a little faster. Even the security guard who greeted her every week seemed unusually reserved. Maya noticed the change, but chose not to ask questions. Her grandmother had always told her that people often feared what they did not understand. She believed kindness required patience, especially when it was not returned immediately. The following morning, Richard Harrison arrived for an early strategy meeting. Before he reached the executive floor, Victor stepped into the elevator beside him carrying a tablet filled with financial reports. "There is something you should know," Victor said carefully. "People are beginning to ask questions about Miss Brooks. Some are concerned that your personal interest in her could create misunderstandings inside the company." Richard remained silent. Victor continued, "It may be wise to limit further contact. Appearances matter." Richard looked toward the changing floor numbers before answering. "Do they matter more than character?" Victor hesitated, caught off guard by the unexpected question. Before he could respond, the elevator doors opened. Meanwhile, Maya finished cleaning a conference room and prepared to leave for the day when her supervisor from Bright Horizon Facility Services called unexpectedly. His voice sounded uncomfortable. "Maya, Harrison Capital has requested a different employee for future assignments. Effective immediately, your schedule has been reassigned." Maya stood quietly beside the large lobby windows, watching leaves drift across the plaza outside. "May I ask if I did something wrong?" she asked gently. A long silence followed. "No complaints about your work," her supervisor admitted. "They simply requested a change." Maya thanked him politely before ending the call. She removed her employee identification badge, placed it carefully inside her pocket, and wheeled her empty supply cart toward the service entrance without a single word of protest. From the top floor, Richard Harrison looked out across the city, completely unaware that the woman who had saved his life had just walked out of his building because of a decision he had never made. The next evening, a quiet rain returned to Charlotte, softer than the storm that had changed 2 lives only days before. Tiny drops gathered on the iron fence surrounding Harrison Capital, while the city lights shimmered across wet sidewalks like scattered pieces of gold. Maya Brooks stood outside the employee entrance holding a small cardboard box containing the few personal items from her housekeeping locker, a family photograph, a well-worn pair of work gloves, and the handwritten recipe her grandmother had copied onto an old index card years earlier. She took one slow breath, adjusted the strap of her backpack, and turned toward the bus stop without looking back. There was no anger in her expression, only the quiet sadness that comes from accepting something she could not control. She had learned long ago that bitterness only made heavy burdens harder to carry. Across the street, buses hissed to a stop while office workers hurried beneath umbrellas, each absorbed in another ordinary evening. None of them noticed the woman walking away from the glass tower with nothing except dignity. Several floors above, Richard Harrison remained alone in his office long after the final executive meeting had ended. The city stretched beneath him in ribbons of light, but instead of reviewing quarterly reports, he found himself staring at the reflection in the darkened window. For the first time in many years, silence felt louder than success. His eyes drifted toward the leather folder still resting on his desk. Inside were witness statements from the bridge, each describing the same extraordinary moment. One sentence had been underlined by Detective Laura Bennett. She did not hesitate. She never asked who he was. Richard read those words again, then closed the folder slowly. Something inside him refused to settle. He pressed the intercom and asked Daniel Mercer to come upstairs. When Daniel entered, Richard spoke quietly. "Schedule another meeting with Miss Brooks tomorrow morning." Daniel hesitated before answering. "I cannot do that, sir." Richard turned. "Why not?" Daniel lowered his eyes. "She is no longer assigned to this building." The room became perfectly still. "Explain." Daniel took a careful breath. "Bright Horizon informed us this afternoon that her assignment ended after a request from senior management." Richard frowned. "I never approved such a request." Daniel remained silent. Richard slowly stood from his chair and walked toward the rain-covered window. Far below, people looked no larger than shadows moving beneath the streetlights. Somewhere among them, the woman who had risked everything for a stranger was simply trying to make it home. He suddenly realized how easily good people could disappear from powerful places without anyone asking why. At that very moment, Maya sat quietly near the back of a city bus as raindrops traced slow paths across the window beside her. She rested the cardboard box on her lap and looked at the blurred lights passing outside. Then her phone vibrated with a message from her grandmother. "Do not worry, sweetheart. God never closes one door without opening another." Maya smiled softly, slipped the phone back into her pocket, and looked toward the dark streets ahead. Neither she nor Richard knew that this quiet evening marked the final moment before everything would change again. Because somewhere inside Harrison Capital, hidden beneath polished floors and expensive promises, someone had already begun setting another tragedy into motion. The following morning arrived beneath a clear blue sky that seemed determined to erase every memory of the recent storms. Sunlight spilled across the polished glass walls of Harrison Capital, turning the building into a towering mirror above downtown Charlotte. Richard Harrison stood alone in his office before anyone else had arrived, holding the witness statements in one hand and the personnel report Daniel Mercer had delivered only minutes earlier in the other. The pages confirmed what troubled him most. Maya Brooks had never received a complaint in 3 years. Every supervisor evaluation described her with the same words: dependable, respectful, and consistently kind. Yet someone had quietly removed her from the building less than 24 hours after she refused his reward. Richard pressed the intercom. "Daniel, bring me every authorization connected to her reassignment." 20 minutes later, several executives gathered around the conference table, including Victor Langley. Richard carefully placed the documents in front of him. "Who approved this?" he asked calmly. Victor answered without hesitation. "I did. I believed it protected the company from unnecessary speculation." Richard studied him for several long seconds. "You dismissed the woman who saved my life because you were protecting appearances?" Victor straightened his jacket. "I acted in the best interest of Harrison Capital." Before Richard could respond, a sharp alarm echoed through the executive floor. Every conversation stopped. Employees looked toward the hallway as emergency lights began flashing above the exits. Daniel checked his phone. "There is an electrical emergency reported in the underground parking garage," he said. "Security is evacuating the building." Richard immediately stood. People moved quickly but calmly toward the stairwells while security officers directed employees outside. Minutes later, Richard reached the covered entrance where firefighters and utility crews had already arrived to inspect the situation. The parking structure remained temporarily closed until engineers completed their safety inspection. Across the street, Maya happened to be waiting at a bus stop. After attending an interview at another office building nearby, she noticed the familiar Harrison Capital logo reflected in the emergency vehicles and instinctively looked toward the entrance. Although she no longer worked there, concern crossed her face. She quietly walked closer, remaining behind the safety barriers with dozens of other pedestrians. As utility workers reviewed electrical diagrams, one veteran technician frowned at a maintenance panel located beside the garage entrance. "Something is wrong," he murmured. "This shutdown should have isolated the entire system." Maya overheard the conversation. During years of housekeeping, she had often watched maintenance teams explain the building's service layout while she cleaned nearby corridors. She remembered one unusual detail. Stepping forward respectfully, she spoke to the technician. "Excuse me, sir. Last month, they moved the backup control cabinet to the east utility room because of renovation work. If the old diagram is being used, part of the system may still be connected." Several people turned toward her. The technician looked surprised, then immediately radioed another crew to verify her observation. Less than 2 minutes later, his radio crackled with an urgent reply. "She's right. The backup circuit was relocated. We found an active section exactly where she described." The technician slowly lowered his radio and stared at Maya with disbelief. Richard, standing only a few yards away, heard every word. In that silent moment, he realized the woman who had once saved his life had just quietly prevented another serious crisis without asking for recognition, while Victor Langley could do nothing except watch the truth unfold before everyone. The crowd remained unusually quiet as utility crews finished securing the parking garage. Morning sunlight reflected across the wet pavement left behind by the emergency vehicles, while employees stood in small groups speaking in hushed voices about what had just happened. The veteran technician walked directly toward Richard Harrison and removed his safety helmet with visible respect. "Sir," he said, "if Miss Brooks had not spoken up when she did, we would have spent valuable time following the outdated plans. Her observation allowed us to secure the remaining electrical circuit before anyone entered the area. She may never call herself an expert, but she paid attention when others did not." Richard looked across the sidewalk where Maya stood with her backpack resting gently over one shoulder. She had already begun stepping away, believing her small contribution was finished, just as she had walked away from the river without waiting for applause. "Miss Brooks," Richard called. His voice carried across the plaza, stopping nearly everyone in place. Maya turned slowly, her expression calm and respectful. Richard crossed the distance between them without hesitation. Executives, employees, reporters, and security officers watched in complete silence as one of the wealthiest men in America stopped only a few feet away from the woman many people inside his own company had overlooked. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then Richard did something no one expected. He extended his hand first. "I owe you more than one apology," he said quietly. "The first is for thanking you with a check instead of understanding your heart. The second is for allowing people under my leadership to treat you unfairly because they misunderstood your character." Maya looked at him with gentle eyes that held neither resentment nor triumph. "People make mistakes, Mr. Harrison," she answered softly. "What matters is what they choose after they see the truth." Those simple words settled over the gathering like a peaceful silence. Richard slowly turned toward Victor Langley, who remained standing near the entrance with his hands folded tightly in front of him. "Leadership is not measured by how well we protect a reputation," Richard said clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "It is measured by how we protect good people." Victor lowered his head, unable to answer. Richard then faced the employees gathered outside the building. "Effective today," he announced, "every decision regarding personnel actions taken during my medical absence will be reviewed independently. Respect will never again depend on someone's job title inside this company." A quiet murmur spread through the crowd. Richard looked back at Maya. "There is one more thing I would like to ask." Maya waited patiently. "I am creating a new foundation dedicated to supporting working families, caregivers, and people whose kindness often goes unnoticed. I would be honored if you would help shape its mission." Maya smiled, but not because of the opportunity itself. "I will help," she replied, "on one condition." Richard nodded. "Name it." "No building should ever carry my name," Maya said. "If this foundation reminds people of anyone, let it remind them that every person deserves to be seen before they are judged." Richard's eyes softened as he slowly nodded in agreement. Around them, cameras captured the moment, but the most powerful image was not the photographs that would appear on tomorrow's front pages. It was the quiet understanding that had finally replaced assumptions, proving that genuine kindness could change not only one life, but the hearts of everyone willing to witness it. 1 year later, the first light of spring drifted gently across Charlotte as warm sunshine spilled through the glass entrance of the Harrison Community Foundation. Children laughed in the small courtyard where fresh flowers surrounded wooden benches engraved with simple messages about compassion, hope, and dignity. Families gathered for free financial workshops. Caregivers shared coffee before beginning another long day. Elderly neighbors found quiet conversations beneath blooming dogwood trees. There were no marble statues honoring billionaires and no portraits celebrating corporate success. Instead, the entrance displayed a single bronze plaque that read, "Every act of kindness matters, even when nobody is watching. Visitors often paused to read those words before stepping inside. Few realized they had been inspired by one ordinary housekeeper who had never asked for recognition. Maya Brooks still woke before dawn every morning in the same modest apartment where she lived with her grandmother, Evelyn. She still prepared oatmeal before leaving for work. She still rode the number 12 city bus whenever she could, greeting the same drivers by name, and offering her seat to anyone who needed it more. Although Richard had invited her to oversee the foundation's outreach programs, Maya insisted on spending one day every week wearing her familiar housekeeping uniform, volunteering at shelters, community centers, and senior housing facilities. "If I ever forget where I came from," she often said with a quiet smile, "I might forget why I started helping people in the first place." Richard Harrison changed as well. His office remained on the top floor of Harrison Capital, but the expensive artwork that once covered the walls had quietly disappeared. In its place hung photographs of volunteers planting gardens, rebuilding homes after storms, and serving meals to strangers. During executive meetings, he no longer began by asking about quarterly profits. His first question became, "How did we improve someone's life this week?" At first, the executives found the question unusual. Eventually, it became the culture of the entire company. Victor Langley resigned several months after the review of personnel decisions revealed a pattern of prejudice and unfair treatment that no longer reflected the values Richard wanted his company to represent. No celebration followed his departure, only quiet accountability. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Richard visited one of the foundation's neighborhood food programs without announcing his arrival. He found Maya standing behind a serving table wearing simple work gloves and the same gentle smile she had carried on the bridge more than a year before. Children waved excitedly as she handed them fresh fruit and warm meals. An elderly veteran thanked her with tears in his eyes. She responded exactly as she always had, with kindness so natural it seemed effortless. Richard remained several steps away, watching in silence. He finally understood that true greatness was never built inside boardrooms alone. It was built in countless unseen moments when someone chose compassion instead of convenience. As the afternoon sun settled lower across the city, Maya packed the final empty boxes into a recycling bin and looked toward the golden lights stretching across the quiet street. Richard walked beside her without speaking. Neither of them felt the need to fill the peaceful silence. The wind carried the laughter of children through the trees while sunlight reflected softly across the windows of the community center. Some stories ended with applause. This one ended with something far more powerful. A life saved had inspired another life to change, and that change continued quietly from one heart to another, proving that kindness was never weakness. It had always been the greatest strength of all.